Ok, je crois qu'on peut, on peut commencer. Donc, d'abord, bienvenue à toutes et tous à ce troisième moment de notre cycle de conférences qui est consacré à l'avenir du travail, la démocratie participative en devenir. Les deux premiers moments étaient consacrés à la question du living wage, fragmentation of societies and the social cohesion. C'était la conférence qu'on a eue mardi soir avec le professeur Gueye. Hier, on a eu un échange sur la question de la digitalisation, la protection sociale et des droits sociaux. Et aujourd'hui, on va avoir un échange sur la question de social justice and environmental justice and how these two questions can be reconciled. We can try to reconcile these two questions. And we have the whole evening and the conference will take place in English because our keynote speaker is English speaking, and so he will deliver. He's a very famous professor in the UK that I will present now briefly. So the whole conference will take place in English, which means that the panelists will then intervene and discuss the paper and discuss the presentation in English. But of course, if the audience wants to have French questions in French, no problem. We will try to have a translation for Jan so that he may Gough, so that he may react to these questions too. But the whole event will take place mainly in English. So this is how the conference will take place. We'll first have a keynote speech by Professor Gough of about half an hour, and then we will have four excellent panelists that will come in front and sit down at this table and react to this to Professor Gough's presentation. We will have first Jean Laville. I will present him afterwards. Then we will have Moustapha, Kamal, Gueye, and then again Gough will be able to react to the discussion, to the reaction of the intervention of the discussants, and in the end we will have another two discussants that will present their reaction. We'll have Professor Jérémy Luchetti, and we will have David Boyce, that is, I don't see over there, and so we will have these two discussions, and in the end again Professor Gough will be able to react. And so after this, that should take about 1 hour and 10 minutes or something like this. We have plenty of time to open the floor and to have a discussion, a public discussion with the whole audience. This is the format that we want to have. Now, some words about Professor Gough, and then I will leave you the floor for about half an hour. I was not supposed, if you read the program carefully, I was not supposed to be the moderator of this conference, but unfortunately my colleague, Professor Marlyne Sahakian, due to very unexpected, last-minute, very unfortunate circumstances, cannot be there. She would have loved being with us, she would have loved being here, but she cannot be there, so you will have to accept that I am taking up her part, if you want, and trying to moderate the session. But she prepared this very carefully and very professionally, and so I will just mainly read what she prepared and then hand back the microphone to people and check the time, saying, look, there you have just 10 minutes and no more, and so you should stop here. So I'm reading what Professor Marlyne Sahakian prepared for the presentation of Professor Gough. Gough is a professor emeritus at the University of Bath, as well as a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In the 1990s, Gough collaborated with Len Doyle to tackle philosophical social questions, which resulted in a very important book, the seminal work, A Theory of Human Need, that maybe most of you may be aware of. In the 1990s, as a chair of social policy at the University of Bath, Professor Gough continued his explorations, focusing on bringing together human need and well-being approaches with political economic considerations. For this, he explored well-being in the context of developing countries. For the last decade, he has been researching the social dimensions of climate change, and obviously, this is what he will talk about today. So he has explored the social dimensions of climate change, the impacts of inequality and capitalist growth on global warming, and the need for what he calls eco-social policies. These deliberations are very well captured in the notion of sustainable well-being, as presenting in the most recent book, which is this one. I think you all received a flyer presenting this book. So Heat, Greed, and Human Need. And we are very happy and very honored to welcome you at the University of Geneva, and I think this is not the first time that you come here, and so we are looking forward to listening to you for the next half an hour. Thank you, Jan, for coming.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. Can people hear me? Is it switched on? Yeah.
To switch this one.
Okay.
Okay.
That's it, yes. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to take part in this series of seminars, and also to be in Geneva. I first visited the ILO in the 1980s. I think it's still my favourite international organisation, and I remember long debates there with Gueye standing and socio-economic well-being and basic income and many other issues, some of which will come round. They go round, they come round. So today, where am I here? I like these three quotations. The bolding one, mentioning how the economy has to change to adjust to a finite planet. And then the one by Bruce Ackerman, we're all in the same boat, but some of us have much nicer cabins than others. This is the issue of social justice and the distribution. And then the one by John Stuart Mill, it's some hardship to be born into the world and to find all nature's gifts previously engrossed. This is the issue of intergenerational justice. So the question which faces us today is an extremely important one, how to relate environmental and social justice. So this is the Anthropocene. These are emissions, total global emissions since 1920, an extremely fast rising curve. You know this stuff, and these are the rising temperatures since 1984. Anything on this map which is yellow or orange or red indicates a rise in temperatures. And one of the striking features here, of course, is the tremendous increase in the Arctic region of the planet. Now, in thinking about this, I still believe that the Brundtland report, which came out 30 years ago, is an extremely good place to start, because they came up with this definition of sustainable development, which is still very often quoted, and I think is still the best. Sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so it has this notion within it, as they go on to say, of needs and limitations. Unfortunately, the Brundtland report didn't say anything more about what human needs are. That's a question I've attempted to address, and we've now got a book coming out to mark the 30th anniversary. I should have brought it along, and to look forward 30 years following the Brundtland report's approach. The Brundtland report, I don't know if many of you know this diagram of Kate Raworth. She calls it the donut, and I prefer to call it the life belt. But it illustrates the issues very clearly, I think. There's a safe and just space for humanity between an upper and a lower limit. The upper limit is the ecological ceiling. And she puts here the 9 boundaries, ecological boundaries, identified by the Stockholm Institute. So the first thing to say is there are 9 of them, and climate change is just one. But it's the one which I'll be talking about today. But there are others: biodiversity loss, water, stress, and so forth. But then there's the inner limit, the social foundation. Many people are living way below any acceptable notion of a decent life, and so we must bring people up to that level. And so there are items of human needs here: food, health, energy, and so forth. And also at the bottom, sort of institutional preconditions for meeting those: political voice, social equity, peace and justice. One can take issue with those, but the idea is a sound one. So the question is, we must move into this safe and just space. if it still exists. So another way of thinking about this is that of global dilemmas. There's a rough double injustice in the world today that those nations, classes and groups least responsible for past embodied emissions are most likely to be adversely affected. And those nations, classes and groups that have done most to cause the build-up of emissions in the world are least likely to be affected. That's obviously a very broad statement and needs to be qualified, but it's roughly true. There's also the issue of inequality, which has been increasing certainly in the West and the North since about 1980, that independently driving up emissions. We can talk about that if we want to. But then there's the possibility of a triple injustice, which is that policies to deal with growing emissions, climate mitigation policies, can themselves exacerbate inequalities and social injustice. So there's a whole sort of tangle of things to look at here. If we're looking at the impacts of climate change, these are fairly well known and documented by the IPCC. The direct impacts on habitats, the mediated impacts on livelihoods and well-being, and indirect impacts. The direct impacts: sea level rise, species loss, storm damage, water stress. The risk to livelihoods and human well-being, food availability in large agricultural areas, water security, health, ill health, and poverty. And indirect impacts, not so much discussed: climate mitigation, distress migration caused by climate change, and conflict. So at best, climate breakdown is a risk multiplier. But of course, we're becoming aware now that the time available to put things right is getting more and more limited. 10 to 12 years, the IPCC says, will determine whether we can avoid dangerous climate change, 2 degrees, even 3 degrees or above. Now, turning to the responsibilities for emissions, and I am concentrating on emissions here, I've said that the main driver of emissions is income. It's the main driver between countries and within countries. This illustrates, if we ranked everyone in the world from richest to poorest, which is done by Piketty and Chancel, then this is the sort of shape of emissions you would get. The top 10%, which is all of us here, account for about 1/2 of total global emissions of greenhouse gases. And the poorest half of the world's population account for around 10%. So some people label this the Plutocene. The Anthropocene plus hyper-inequality means we're talking about the Plutocene. There's a great difference in the emissions of different peoples. So this turns us to the issues of justice and rights. The language of rights can help us here. The Universal Declaration of 1948 refers to procedural and substantive rights. Procedural rights, political and civil rights. But the substantive rights have been documented and elaborated since then. I'm sure you all know this, in various ways to look at socio-economic rights. And the Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by the United Nations in 2015, is by far the most comprehensive statement of these rights. Now, if we turn to rights imply duties or obligations, and God Lord, this is a huge area discussed by ecological philosophers and environmental scientists and so forth. But I think there are three obligations on which there's considerable agreement. The first is there must be a ceiling to the total quantum of emissions in the future to avoid dangerous climate change. The second is that there must be a fair allocation of these emissions, a fair allocation, which implies some notion of contraction and convergence as we bring people together in a safe and just space. And the third condition is that climate change is already happening, is causing distress and problems, so there has to be adaptation and compensation, and there needs to be fair funding of adaptation and compensation. Some would also add here a willingness to accept climate refugees. I might come around to that in the end. All these three pretty much add up to the same nations that are going to have to bear these obligations, which is the global north. Now, I've mentioned my book. Oh, actually, can I pass this round? People might like to have a look at it. In the book, Heat, Greed and Human Need, I argue at some length that human needs, the notion of universal human needs, must form the foundation for thinking about these issues. I could go into that, but I've chosen not to here, but I'm happy to argue the case. I don't think there's any other conception of well-being which can encompass well-being on a global scale and on an intergenerational scale. Certainly consumer preferences and wants won't do the trick. And I'm also not convinced by Amartya Sen's notion of capabilities, which is often put forward as an alternative measure. I think we need a notion of universal human needs to make sense of these issues. One of the implications of that is that human needs trump consumer preferences. There will be conflicts between the two, and normatively, I think the case can be made that human needs, meeting human needs, has priority. This is Professor Stewart at Oxford. It is not equitable to ask some people to surrender necessities so that other people can retain luxuries. The costs ought to be partitioned into costs that impinge upon necessities and costs that only impinge upon luxuries. So what that implies is there is a distinction which we can conceive of between necessities and luxuries. And a large part of the book, especially chapter 7, is spent addressing those issues. But returning to the first goal, thanks. Okay, returning to the first goal, to stay within a global limit of total carbon emissions. I mean, carbon emissions are a flow, but they join the atmosphere and they stay there for about 1,000 years, so there's a stock issue. And the key thing is to keep the total stock of CO2 and of other greenhouse gases within a safe level. So there's a notion of a carbon budget. So the rise in emissions, which I showed, has to be slowed, then stopped, then reduced at an incredibly fast speed if we're to, say, stay safe. And the later we leave it, the faster the reduction has to be. But when we look at the figures, it's a daunting challenge. The IPCC's estimate of the available global carbon budget that would offer a 66% chance of remaining within the 1.5 degree warming target is 420 billion tonnes of CO2. That's what's left for us to emit. If you divide this figure between all the people on Earth today, and by the years left this century, then that means an allowance of 0.7 tonnes per person. The present consumption in the UK is 12.1 tonnes per person. So there's a huge gulf here between what is desirable and what's the case. Thinking about it doing a different calculation, Professor Tim Jackson says the UK's carbon budget, our share of that 420 billion tonnes, would be exhausted by 2023, in just 4 years' time. So it's a daunting challenge. Okay, that's the first part. How am I doing for time? All right, on time. So now I want to turn to the second part, which is what can we do about it? And in the book, I argue there are 3 meta-strategies for a just transition to a low-carbon and eventually a zero-carbon world. And I think that there's only these 3, but I might be wrong. The first is green growth, to ramp up the eco-efficiency of production, to decouple production from emissions. That's the green growth scenario. That is the dominant strategy today. And then, turning to the third one here for the moment, there are those who advocate degrowth, that we cannot have continual growth on a finite planet. And so at some stage we have to reduce absolute levels of consumer demand and move to a steady state economy. The gulf between these two approaches, I mean, I come across it all the time at the LSE and elsewhere, is so vast that I wonder whether one can conceive of a transitional phase, and that's what I argue for, a fair to recompose consumption. So between these two, we can think of recomposing consumption in the rich world, switching from high to low carbon consumption, and which also entails switching in part from luxuries to necessities. That's the idea of recomposition. These are the 3 strategies I put forward. I'll consider each in turn, but I've added fair in front of each of these. Each of these should be just and not penalise the worse off, the poor, the vulnerable. So all of these should be fair. Okay, so now C1, this is the green growth scenario. This is the scenario of the Paris Climate Conference. The goal is to decouple output and emissions by the second half of the 20th century. That's now being brought forward. The UK government has just agreed a target of zero net carbon in 2050, which is, I think, we're one of the first countries to do that. And the net is quite carefully defined too. It's saying you can't offload to developing countries and grow forests. You've got to do it in your own territory. But of course others are arguing that it must be brought forward from 2050 to 2040, 2030, 2025. Incredibly narrow time spans. But anyway, this was the goal of the climate conference, and it left it to national governments to determine their contributions, their nationally determined contributions. The Grantham Institute and others have added these all together, what their commitments have been so far, and they find they're about 1/4 of the way to meeting the 2-degree target. And they're even further off meeting the 1.5-degree target. But despite that, I mean, partly due to that, there are a large number of carbon mitigation programs in place in countries across the world. I think we can broadly distinguish 3 here. There's carbon pricing, either through carbon taxes or cap and trade. There's regulations to alter the insulation of houses or the performance of refrigerators, or I mean, thousands and thousands of regulations here which are relevant. And thirdly, there's green investment in new forms of infrastructure. Of these, carbon pricing is still mainly advocated by economists, but I find they don't look at the distributive consequences of this. Carbon pricing is almost always regressive. It impacts more, it raises the prices of facing poorer households more than better off. Partly this is due to the, if you look at the big three necessities, which is food, domestic energy and basic transport, they are all carbon intensive, very carbon intensive. And so that alone makes raising the price of those regressive. And it can be counterproductive, as in the leading to protests about green taxes, as for example the Gilets jaunes in France. And then I want this third point here, I think is very important. Compensation for this, I'm convinced, does not work. The usual answer of economists is compensate the losers, compensate the losers. But I'm convinced that this can't be done either through means-tested benefits or through a general citizen payback of the revenue from carbon taxes. So this is a crucial stage in my argument. I say we must move towards integrated eco-social policies. We can't have the eco policies and then compensate with the social policies. That won't work. We need integrated policies. So the goal is both welfare and sustainability. We must also, of course, ensure that climate policies don't threaten human welfare. There's a slide here on biomass energy, which I think I'll avoid for the moment. So what sort of eco-social policies can we envisage here? Well, first of all, green investment, green jobs, and a Green New Deal. These are classic policies which, if designed well, can improve well-being in various ways and can reduce emissions. Retrofitting of the entire housing stock, public transport, decarbonising food. So that is a major feature of eco-social policies, which still operates within the green growth framework, hence I call them C1 policies. Another, which I favour, is social tariffs for electricity, gas and water. The first units of those are charged at a low rate, and then the rate charged increases steadily as you move up, as consumption increases. I think social tariffs could serve a useful purpose here. And so the idea of these is that synergies are realised. I've spoken so far about some of the conflicts that there can be between social justice and environmental justice, but there are also clear synergies, as when air pollution is reduced or nutrition is improved and livelihoods become more sustainable. So that's a whole set of areas that we can talk about. I'd also say here it's important to develop and defend the traditional welfare states. Despite everything, they provide safety nets, critical basic services and social investments, and they enhance resilience in the face of shocks. I was struck by the number of deaths in New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina, 1,800 or so, which revealed the inadequacies of some aspects of welfare in the United States. I've also heard that the number of deaths in Cuba, which was affected by the same hurricane, was 2. So there's some notion of being prepared in a welfare system for shocks. So I think social policy is an important precautionary climate strategy in its own right. But now I say none of this can be sufficient. All of it's desirable. I'm not saying it's not, but it won't be enough. We cannot get the emissions down fast enough through these methods alone. And also they leave some of the great inequalities and injustices untouched. So we need to recompose consumption to reduce consumption emissions by switching, as I said, from high to low carbon goods and services. Here's a little example. Gandhi said there's plenty in this world for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. This is from the World Bank of all places. They calculate that if the 40 million drivers of SUVs in the USA changed to ordinary standard European cars, the emissions saved would enable all the people in the world that currently don't have electricity to have a basic amount of electricity, 1.6 billion. So there are issues here. And also another reason for concentrating on consumption is this diagram. Emissions can be calculated on a territorial basis, or what are the emissions embodied in the consumption of populations in different countries. Since about 1980, there's been a widening gap here between the OECD countries and the rest of the world. Because we outsource our production to China and elsewhere, China has a large number of emissions, but the goods consumed are in the West, in the North, and don't count. So this is the difference between, so I'm not explaining this very well, between consumption-based emissions and territorial emissions, which is, I think, a very important diagram. And this is from some scenario building in Sweden, which illustrates some of the points I'm making. Looking at scenarios up to 2050 of greenhouse gas emissions. If you have business as usual, that'll be the top line of soaring emissions. If you assume that the eco-efficiency rate improves as much as it has in the past, that will bring you down to the red line, nearly level, but nowhere near enough. If you assume that it's doubled the eco-efficiency rate, that takes you to the blue line. These are big asks because right across the economy, the low-hanging fruit is usually picked first. So they say that's still not enough to get down to the 2-degree target, and so they have post-material scenarios, which is the same as my recomposed consumption scenario. They say limits on large second homes, a decrease in meat eating, things like that. Changing consumption patterns could bring you down to the green line. But they say that still wouldn't be enough. And then finally, they argue for a reduced working week and reduced work time as a way of reducing total consumption to enable Sweden to reach the safe target. How can we... We're into sort of very difficult territory here, clearly. We're challenging what we all conceive. I put forward two main approaches here. The first is to expand public services, social consumption, universal basic services. It's taking off now as a concept and a slogan, to expand and strengthen public provision, going beyond health and education, which is pretty much constant in the OECD, to other areas, water, housing, transport. For example, free bus services as a way of encouraging public transport. And I think arguments can be made here, especially on the grounds of equality and sustainability. Public services are an incredibly equalizing mechanism. The OECD calculated that free services were worth 75% of the real income of the lowest decile families and 15% of income of the highest decile families. If you want to redistribute income, giving everyone basic services is a very efficient way of doing it. And there are also arguments that it is more sustainable. And then the second is something which Marlyne Sahakian, who should have been here tonight, has been a very strong advocate of, a consumption corridor, to move towards a sustainable corridor of personal consumption between minimum standards, allowing every individual to live a satisfactory life, and maximum standards to stay within ecological limits. And this has been argued by ecologists such as Herman Daly. He's always said that if there are limits to the total amount that people can have, and if we want a minimum, then at some point there must be a maximum. Now this is getting really controversial, but here's some policies which I think could start to move in that direction. First of all, smart VAT. We have a huge tax on consumption across Europe, but it's pretty much the same apart from where vested interests have altered it. You could start using VAT, differentiating it between necessities and luxuries and between high consumption and low consumption goods. And then there's frequent flyers tax advocated by Piketty and others, and taxing and controlling advertising and product placement. I think these are sort of transitional policies which would enable a move towards some more rational form of consumption. Then the third one is a challenge to endless growth. The arguments against endless growth are biophysical, clearly. They can also be ethical and social. That pursuing more and more material goods is bad for broader notions of well-being. But this is the area which poses the greatest problems for social policy, in which I've been studying all my life, because the welfare state clearly depends on the tax state, which clearly depends on the growth state. So how you break with that is difficult. It comes down, essentially, it seems to be, to reduce and redistribute. And reduced work time here, it could be a very important policy. And Juliet Shaw and others have made very strong arguments that reducing work time can reduce consumption and emissions. And then redistribute. And we're into sovereign wealth funds and social commons and other forms of redistribution in order to eventually deal with a zero growth society. I'd also mention that many economists seem to agree that growth is slowing down anyway, and Wolfgang Streeck, for example, argues this. So we might be getting there before very long. And then finally, there's the absent global dimension. So stopping. Right. Which I know less about, but I assume lots of people here do. The Paris Agreement and the green growth approach is pretty uninterested, it seems to me, in issues of equity. And Nick Stern at the LSE, whose work I admire a lot in many ways, said there's little point in equitable access to a train wreck. The key thing is to get emissions down. Equity can come later. I don't think that's right, and we must put global issues back on the agenda, and the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, I hope, will do that. But at present, it's a very marginal concern. I was interested here in the ILO social protection floors recommendation to establish social floors, and I think that's a very important policy which would contribute in some ways to the building on the social foundations for the safe and just space. But I would argue, towards the bottom here, that I think there needs to be more emphasis on services alongside social transfers. It seems to me that a lot of the work is on transfers and not enough on services. For example, housing, it seems to be a crucial service which crosses over, is situated on issues of the environment and social justice very centrally. I see that the IMF now has included services in its definition of social protection. I don't know what that will result in. Climate migration, I don't think I've got time for that now. So, just to conclude, there seems to be 5 ways to combine social and environmental justice, each, I think, more demanding than the previous one. The first is eco-social programs like Green Jobs, Green New Deal to tap synergies between well-being and sustainability. The second is universal basic services to increase public consumption. The third is a consumption corridor, a new way to address inequalities in private consumption. The fourth is to prepare for post-growth. And the fifth is to somehow, I don't know how, try to deal with the tremendous inequalities and injustices on a global scale. But I think I'd better stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian, for this contribution. I now invite our 4 panelists to come up and sit down at the table. I think you will be at the center of the table.
Okay.
And while you are getting here, I will present the first 2 speakers, the first 2 panelists to react. Can be here or sitting down at the table as you prefer. So the first one will be Jean Laville, who is just standing near me, close to me. Jean Laville has been active in the financial sector for over 30 years, including 20 in the field of responsible investment. He is currently working at the Swiss Sustainable Finance Association, where he is responsible for liaising with members in Western Switzerland and for directing the work stream on capacity building and education. You are also a partner at Concert Invest since 2012, which is an independent advisory and asset management firm dedicated to sustainable investment solutions for private and institutional clients. And then after you, we will listen to, I will present the 2 of you so you can speak in a row and I don't need to interrupt you. So after you, we will have Dr. Moustapha Gueye, who is the coordinator of the Green Jobs program at the ILO in Geneva. His work is focused on promoting positive employment in relation to climate change, the green economy, and sustainable development. You previously served at the United Nations Environment Programme, and you also spent several years working across Asia. And I will not say more because I think it's much more interesting to listen to you. And so, Jean Laville, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for offering me the opportunity to discuss some issue on sustainability this evening. I thank Professor Gough for sharing us their view, which was a very interesting point. But during the presentation, I feel, more and more uncomfortable because at the same time I was measuring, the hurdle we have to solve, to get out of our problem. I think that I don't know if you are optimist, if you are able in 20 years to implement such solutions. Perhaps you can share with us this view, but I feel wow, so much to do and not so many, positive feedback. We have seen more living in a more negative retro feedback. So it's a huge challenge. What I want to share with you is sometimes where we are in finance, just to see, because it's not been directly assessed here, but behind that. So we have a system, we have the capitalists there. Can we be able to transform this capitalism in a way that it fits to this type of map, which gives us a chance to get out of this sustainability trap, and at the same time building a more nice place to live without less inequalities? Can we solve all those problems at a time with the system we have? It's not clear. And the answer is that I want just to, as is a week of democracy, I want to share with you that there is something has changed in capitalism, and this something has to be linked to democracy, since this primary capitalism, where we have one shareholder managing the company, the president, the PDG, We have moved for another type of capitalist, where now a company have thousands, even millions of shareholders. And we are no more in a sense that we have one monarchy. We have some, what we call now some shareholder democracy. So capitalists have changed. And who has a shareholder now? It's no more this guy with the hat and the cigar. No more exists, this guy. This guy who are now the shareholder of capitalists is you and me. It's especially in Switzerland and other countries, we have some retirement program with capitalization. We have a lot of now, commonly we hold now more than 70% of shareholder. We are commonly, the shareholder now, are these people behind the pension fund, behind the insurance, behind other what they have of funds. So it's this move, as we call, of shareholder democracy, which has a profound change in capitalism, from this monarchy to this shareholder democracy. If you want that I give you an example of a shareholder democracy, is exactly what we have here. Who remembers the Minder initiative? The Minder initiative was an entrepreneur was not happy with what's happening with big remuneration at US, etc. And he set up this idea to force companies to propose a vote on shareholders, on remuneration for major managers, and at the same time force pension funds to vote. If they don't vote on remuneration, they will have problems. They will have problems. And we have now more than 30 articles in our constitution describing this process. And what's behind that? What was the idea of mine there? It was the one I developed during tenure when I work as Ethos Foundation and making some shareholder activists on remuneration, environmental, social issues. It's the idea that we can control this capitalism. We can give an idea, we can reorient this capitalism by discussing and trying to change the game of the rules for managers, to reorient remuneration, to try to discuss what is a fair remuneration, what kind of incentives do we want for those remuneration. It's just always the same, maximizing growth and minimizing cost, etc., to create the maximum of margin for the shareholder. Do we still want to have this Anglo-Saxon capitalism working here? And the discussion is really open now. And we are in this situation where at the same time we are all more and more exposed to this remuneration from markets, from financial markets, through our pension funds, because we all have this idea to get retired one day, if possible. And at the same time, we see how much this capitalism is generating negative externalities to generate these dividends. For example, just to give you an idea, we're speaking of CO2. We have measured that the CO2, which needed to be generated to generate the dividend for the pension fund here in Switzerland, is the same amount of the dividend we generate as a citizen on economy as a whole. We generate as much CO2 to collect our dividends for our pension funds. That's the CO2 we need to work in Switzerland. You see how much the financial system is exposed and how much we are directly involved. How do we want to manage this capitalism? How do we want to manage this shareholder democracy? That is a choice, because behind this presentation, you see how much the challenge. How do we take all those decisions? You have mentioned here, how do we take collectively this decision? Perhaps Switzerland is a good place to imagine. How we have, if you have seen how it has happened now with the CO2 law, we see some now taxes coming, which is now defended by coalition which generally do not want any tax. We see now some people saying, okay, we need to do something which is not exactly in line with what we had in the past, which is no legislation, just let the market do. And now there is a recognition that given the size of our externalities, even the business is calling for regulation, for new direction. And it is done exactly as the same with shareholders. We have now a massive coalition trying to engage with company on CO2. What is your business model? Why do you continue to reinvest to generate new source of CO2. This action is called Climate 100 to 100, and it's just focusing on the biggest 100 CO2 emitter in the world. And now we see some reaction from companies now. Oh, they have to justify why, and they have to justify in front of the shareholder. How do you think you will be? Imagine that this will be sustainable to do that. They will have a chance to continue to invest in extracting whatever coal, gas, etc., if at the same time society is really implementing what is they want to do with the Paris Agreement. So you have to justify that in front of shareholders. And I have access to some CEO which has big CEO are under pressure. I don't say it will solve. I just say now this democracy that we see here, we have election now, and we have to decide who we will send to our parliament to decide this framework, because now we have to decide. And it's clearly that will be, it's actually the team on how we get out that. And at the same time, we have pension fund doing the same at concert. We have advising, we take pension fund boards between 2, 3, 4 hours and say, what do you want? What are your values? What do you want to do with your pension fund? What do you want to do with your money? It's good to project how much money you will receive in 30 years, but what will be the life of people in 30 years? You have to imagine there is a correlation between your investment decision and your future. And we see now coming some decision to exclude coal, etc. We see that from a realignment of the citizen behind the capital. You see that now, we see that pension fund are now pressure from the old mentionee where, I vote for going out of coal, I vote for supporting social justice. Why do I have to accept anything with my investment? And we see the role of the citizen coming, I want to align also my money with the way I behave, when I vote, how I consume. That's moving, and that's very interesting. It's increasing, and we have to attract now more things. Next week, we have a long journey. We have organized a Building Bridge Week here in Geneva. During 1 week, we will have about 30 events linking it's a bridge, United Nations and the financial sector, to see how now we can put this knowledge, because the financial sector has no knowledge on that. It's just know about risk and return, not about sustainability. How we can put knowledge into the systems that we have a chance that some decisions have been taken more informed. That's a challenge. But when I come to your 3 points, which was fair green growth, that's something can be fit in the model. Green, it's now, fair is green growth. The second is fair recomposition of consumption. We can see very interesting initiative, for example, Unilever has decided to stop the production of Magnum, this ice, because they consider, yes, it's a very stupid product. They don't think it's a product we have the future. It's chaîne du froid, it's not good for eating, it's plastic, etc. They have decided, no, we cannot claim to be sustainable and continue to produce that type of goods. That's an interesting. But the third one, fair degrowth, I don't know what it means in our system. How do you implement in a system manager? We still have the dominant model for a manager is to maximize profit by maximizing production and minimizing cost, including minimizing wages. How do you do that? How do you do degrowth in this model? That's something cannot fit. I don't see how. Even if you dematerialize, etc., you cannot imagine the concept of degrowth is totally incompatible with the system, actually. You cannot be paid for not producing a good. We have to change a lot of mentality on that. So it's my question on last point, how we have a lot of work, because it's where we have the most difficulties. Green growth is okay. Recomposition consumption, the market can follow. But how to organize a degrowth with the financial sector, with company, that's really a big challenge. Thank you.
to move it on, yeah. Right. Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be joining you in this part of the session. I think we had a very, very inspiring opening presentation by Professor Gough. It was excellent in terms of framing. I thought, coming from the ILO, what I would like to do in these comments within 10 minutes is to zoom a little bit more into how in the world of work we see the interface between the imperative of environmental sustainability on the one hand and the social agenda, the social justice agenda, which is an equally important imperative. But I wanted to come first on the challenges that Professor has described. But if we turn them into what we see in the world of work, the physical impacts of climate change, they translate into, those hurricanes in the Katrina, what we have seen recently in Southern Africa and elsewhere, and you measure them in terms of the loss of working lives. We have found that between the beginning of this century and 2015, some 23 million working lives have been lost. And to connect it to that notion of equity and social justice, you'll see that the burden of loss of human life, and here we're talking of working human life, are in regions of the world that account less for carbon emissions. That's the Asia-Pacific, Pacific Island states, the Philippines, and Africa. Now, this is a matter of concern, and that's something that is unacceptable. The second element I want to bring to attention is that when we think of the physical impacts of climate change, what we see in the media is often the melting glaciers, its sea level rise, and its impact in terms of coastal erosion. But there is another very important physical phenomenon that is coming out of a warming planet, which is the mere fact of the warming of temperatures. And I think the name of the book itself speaks of heat. Now, what we've tried to do in the eye was to understand what is it that warming temperatures would have in terms of impacts on health and productivity in the workplace. So what we have measured using data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but then turning it into work time, is that with current patterns of warming temperatures, by 2030, it's on average some 2.2% of working time that will be lost around the world. And if you look at the world regions which are warmer, my own region, Western Africa, we're talking of close to 5% of working time. And that's the same for Southern Asia. Now, if you just stick to the world average, 2.2% of working time, and we translate it into full employment, we come to 80 million jobs. That's 80 million jobs equivalent that will be lost by 2030 because it would just be too hot to work, and that's significant loss in productivity for enterprises, but it also means increased risk in terms of occupational safety and health in the workplace. Now, I want to turn to the positive agenda. These are challenges, but a message that we want to bring is that climate change is a major challenge, but it is not climate change and action to address it that will cause massive disruption in our economies and societies and cause significant loss of employment. To the contrary, it's inaction against climate change that will cause massive disruption. Now, what we have done last year using the World Employment and Social Outlook, which is one of the flagship reports in the ILO, was to run a modeling exercise of what would be the job impacts if countries go ahead and implement the Paris Agreement on climate change. And in our scenarios, we focus on the energy sector with specifically 3 measures: that countries scale up the use of renewable energy, clean energy in our energy mix, that they improve significantly energy efficiency, and that we deploy more significantly electric vehicles. we find that with measures of that nature, it is possible to generate some 24 million additional jobs in the world economy. Now, there is also going to be job displacement. And what you see in this figure is that that job displacement will happen mostly in the Middle East and in Africa. So it will be in regions of the world that will keep depending significantly on fossil fuel-based sources of energy, while the rest of the world would move towards a low-carbon energy. Now, the net gain is 18 million. It's still positive, but what we need to retain is that we are on a positive narrative. Dealing with the environmental challenges of our time is not going to lead to massive job losses. It will rather create more and better jobs, a lot of green jobs. But having said that, we also must recognize that this is not going to happen by default. There needs to be an alignment of economic policies and those policies that deal with environmental challenges on the one hand, with social policies. And I think what Professor has said, socio-economic policies is that combination that we're looking at. And that is what in our language we're framing as a just transition. In 2015, the ILO tripartite constituents adopted a set of guidelines. They have a very long name, but each of the words in that name has a meaning, and they stand for guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. Now, I won't go into the 9 policy areas that the guidelines address, but just focusing on 2 areas that we find to be very important in this journey. One is that there will be need for skills for smooth transition in labor markets. Skills development, skills rebuilding, upgrading will be required first because the job potential that we see, these 24 million jobs, will need to be captured. There will be occupations that don't exist today for which there will be need to build that human capacity. But on the other hand, because there will be transformation in all sectors of the economy, we will have to perform work in agriculture, in construction, in the service industries differently than the way we're doing business today. So that will require retraining, requalification of the workforce. So that will be necessary for a smooth transition and avoid the social disruptions that some are worried about. Now, the second element is what the professor has framed in terms of the social protection for. There is a lot of attention on adaptation to climate change. Most developing countries want to focus their attention on adaptation rather than mitigation, which is fair enough. But what we are arguing is that adaptation to climate change is not just about building walls along the sea in the Pacific or the Caribbean islands or in African coastal states. It is about building the social resilience of society, of enterprises and workers. And so we find there are many ways through which social protection measures that help with services, but also cash transfers and other measures could be combined with what countries are using on adaptation to climate change so that there will be coherence in the social and environmental measures that will allow a just transition for all. So the message to recap is that climate is one of the major challenges. Our International Labour Conference this year recognized that it will be one of the major drivers in the future of work. But we recognize that dealing with climate change is not going to be the reason for massive economic and social disruption. It will rather secure jobs, it will save enterprises, and it will allow more social justice because inaction will cause more losses to the poor and the vulnerable than to the rich. So therefore, this coherence between environmental justice and social justice is what we see as fundamental in the journey. And I thank you very much and look forward to further discussing this point. Thank you.
Well, is this on? Yes. Thank you both. I agree with both in large part. Kamal, sorry, Moustapha, what you've done is to sort of flesh out the sort of arguments that I call C1 policies, which enable these synergies to be developed between sustainability and justice. I just find this extremely useful. I wish I'd had time to look more carefully at the work of the ILO, but the role of providing new skills for this massive economic transformation we're going to go through, and public employment programs, and linking these with climate adaptation programs is all excellent. This is the investment approach, the green jobs approach, which I was talking about, I found that very useful. I mean, the notion, I was always anxious to stress there are conflicts and there are synergies, and you've stressed the synergies. And the notion, I mean, Trump's notion that the future is coal is just silly. I mean, it's just that cannot be a sensible program for a capitalist economy, and welcoming this transformation is the right way forward. Which brings me on to Jean. And here I've got a lot more agreement than you might think. I remember talking to the professor of finance at LSE a few months ago, and he said finance is much more mobile than industry. It doesn't have a lot of sunk capital. It can move funds pretty quickly away from coal, away from oil, if it chooses to, if it's pushed to. And I mean, really fast, and this can lead to stranded assets and which have been much discussed. So I accept the way in which forms of capitalism can drive this transformation, and I agree with you. There is a distinction still, I think, between Anglo-Saxon capitalism and European capitalism. In fact, the last chapter of my book tries to develop that. The three countries which are consistently found to be climate laggards are the United States, Canada, and Australia, by political scientists. And it's not surprising they have a particular form of capitalism which drives that. So reorienting capitalism. But my problem is twofold. First of all, it doesn't pay much attention to equity and to groups that will be badly affected, not just stranded assets, but stranded regions, stranded communities. That needs the notion of a just transition. So justice arguments need to be built into this switch of capital when it comes. And the second thing is it won't be fast enough to achieve this extraordinary decarbonisation of the planet which is required, which is why I go on to the second, the recomposition of consumption arguments. Lastly, your point about green growth being completely incompatible with capitalism, degrowth, is quite correct. It's inconceivable to think of a capitalist system which doesn't have this drive for accumulation and growth. That raises huge questions, but I think that is the end goal we're going to have to think about. And I've always been interested in Wolfgang Streeck and other arguments that some American economists arguing that productivity is gradually slumping towards zero. It's about 1% now, I think, in the OECD world. So that we are going to have to think about a slower growth world in any case. Perhaps that's enough for the moment.
Okay, and I will now invite our two other panelists to react to Professor Gough's intervention. We'll have first David Boyce, who is Deputy General Secretary of Public Services International, which is a global trade union federation with 20 million members in 150 countries. David works with unions with governance responsibilities of some of the largest capitalized pension funds, managing the deferred wages of public service workers. He's a recognized authority in the water sector, and he was a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, where he helped steer the concept of public-public partnerships as an alternative to privatization. I think that will be okay, and I will just say some words so that we may have it in a row. So Jérémy Luchetti is professor here at the University of Geneva. He holds a PhD in economics from the HEC Montréal, so the business school at the University of Montréal. Before joining the University of Geneva as an associate professor, he held a postdoctoral position at the University of Bern. And most importantly, his research draws from political economics and environmental economics, bringing both theoretical deliberations and empirical methods in his investigation. His most recent work spans various issues of societal interest, including the link between water scarcity and social unrest, the role of land deals on conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, and the impact of income inequality on conflict and democratization. Now, I think all of us are eager to listen to both of you, since we know who you are.
Allez, merci. Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening. For those who don't know what a trade union does, is we represent workers vis-a-vis their employer. We are legally required to negotiate collective agreements that set the wages and working conditions. In public services, we generally feel that we have further obligations, because when you work for the public sector, you're not trying to earn $1 million by the time you're 24, 6 million by the time you're 26, and 10 million by the time you're 30. We have, and our members have, a commitment to public service, which means serving the public. Look, we see on climate that the crisis is, according to IPCC, faster, deeper, and more extensive than even their most radical models allowed for. For us, the 40-year experiment with neoliberalism that really took off with Margaret Thatcher, trying to privatize everything and establish direct links between individuals and providers of service through money, is one of our significant events that set the world on course for deep, deep problems. So it really was an attempt to have us deconstruct our collective way of moving forward in solidarity, evidently saying the market has all the solutions and government has to get out of the way, and that we have to shrink it as small as possible to, what is it, drown it in a bathtub? And what you're hearing now is this concept of creating the enabling environment for investors. And that enabling environment goes through privatization. And privatization is one of the biggest problems we deal with, because clearly good wages and good working conditions are a threat to profits. And most privateers have to obey the short-term profit demands from their very democratic shareholders that we heard about before. Look, as an aside, I've dealt with the pension funds, which are deferred wages of workers. These are capitalized pension funds where, for example, 14% of my wage is sent somewhere that I don't know into some pool collectively where it's managed in my interest. Now, we talk about shareholder democracy, but the fact is that fiduciary law, which the financial sector wants to impose very heavily on us, limits the range of action that we can take. So we heard an example about caps on CEO salaries, which in the USA are outrageous. That took 20 years. We don't have 20 years. We can't wait for slow nibbling away with shareholder pressure. We've got to change, and we've got to do it through system change, not just through little attempts to tweak the edges. So for me, the part of the problem that we've seen as a result of 40 years is we have corporate capture in almost every sphere of our lives. We now have the International Chamber of Commerce is an observer formally at the UN. Their influence in all of the UN agencies, including in the ILO, is growing. And so, look, it starts when you're a kid. The corporations tell you what your needs are. Well, they're not needs, because I got a 6-year-old son now. He needs more Pokemon cards. No, he doesn't. But anyways, so for us, corporate capture that defines what laws or what few laws we can pass and what regulations we're not allowed to enforce, we're seeing them in the trade agreements. If you actually unpack them and analyze them, you see that these deals, which are basically industry telling government what to agree on, and basically rich countries forcing other countries to sign up, is basically about setting limits against maximization of profits. And so there's this whole process, which has been going on for at least 40 years, is something we have to break. We can't tweak the edges. We've got to break it. Now, I agree with almost everything Professor Gough said. My question is, okay, how to move to awareness? And I mean, I've told Wendy at the back that when your book comes her way, just to put it in her bag so that we can take a look at what it really says. But I mean, again, the trade unions, who are in most every community in countries where they allow trade unions to exist, because some don't, we have to take our responsibility for what's going on. And so in public services, it's a little bit easier because we're not so deeply tied into the consume, produce, grow wages. But a lot of trade unions, that's their reality. The more you buy, even if you don't need it, the more they're going to tell me on the factory floor to produce, and the more our wages will go up. But hang on, all those factories are now non-union, and they've gone to the lowest wage countries, thanks to free trade? No. Anyway, so for us, how to move to awareness. And we have people all around here, but how to move from awareness to action. And so again, this is where Greta Thunberg is doing a phenomenal job. And my kids are doing a phenomenal job. And I hope your kids and some of the kids in this room are doing that job. And it's up to us as trade unionists to start doing it in every country, because awareness to action is the key stumbling block. And we work with a lot of academics to bring us good empirical analyses, but we've got to move it out. So how do we do that? What's the best way to do it? And how quickly can we do it? Because what I'm personally concerned about is that we're moving into the need to engage in not evolution, but revolution. And we know that that's just ugly. So for us, we thoroughly agree. The government has got to recapture the mandate that we give our governments. We don't tell them to serve the corporations. We need to act in our own communities and to say to our governments, do what we, the many, need, and not what they, the few, need, so that we are better represented. And they've got to recapture the legal, regulatory enforcement mechanisms that have been watered down, such that exactly we can ensure universal access to quality public services, that we can recapture, for example, the energy sector. This will be, I'm counting on you to give me a 2-minute signal, please. Because, so for example, we represent a lot of coal burners. We represent a lot of oil and natural gas burners. They're our members. And clearly, they don't want to lose their jobs. But the analysis we've done through an organization called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and I encourage you to look, is that the way it's going, we will no way reach the renewable energy generation using the for-profit model. It's just not happening. And we now have 20 years of analysis to show the companies aren't investing. And so what they want is public subsidies for private profits. Well, why should we give them public subsidies? Let's do it ourselves. Let's do it with our own rules. Let's bring the technology to our communities and have good local jobs. This for us is in the energy sector is absolutely a requirement. Ian, you talked about, you know, welfare, tax and growth. Yeah, but if those who should pay taxes pay their taxes, we'd already be a good way down the road. And I'm sure we could look at a couple of the communes in Switzerland to find places where you can hide your taxes really, really easily. And you could probably find a number of the companies who help you do that if you've got enough money or if you're a multinational. So for us, a global tax deal, rewriting the trade rules, which actually limit governments from taking initiatives. So why shouldn't public procurement in your city be able to say, I choose for our citizens to purchase goods locally? You're not allowed to do that. You have to open your bidding to the whole world as a public agency. So these rules that we're bound up in have to be rewritten, but we don't have time to rewrite them. We got to break them. Okay, I got to be careful of what I say because I am representing PSI, and we don't advocate violent change, but poverty is violence. And the violation of our rights around the world is violence, and privatization of public services does violence to our jobs and to our living standards. So we've got to use the tools of collective action. We have some great tools here in Geneva. Somebody was talking about maybe there will be a law voted about limiting CEO salaries, or there'll be a law. Wasn't there a proposal here about raising taxes? And of course it died a dismal death. But the other thing is in healthcare, we represent the majority of healthcare workers in the world. And first of all, there's not enough. Not even close to being enough healthcare workers, let alone all the stuff they're going to have to deal with this climate chaos that is coming our way. Second of all, healthcare is largely a female ghetto. It's underpaid, it's understaffed, it's overstressed. They can't survive. Just look at in France, which has one of the best health systems on the planet, and the strike they've had now for 3 months in the emergency rooms in the hospitals. This is because the staff can't handle it. Now, I don't know if there's any Americans in the room. No, the Swiss have almost the same system. You pay for it or you die, right? That's not a model we want. So, look, there's lots more points here. Maybe there'll be some questions and answers to provoke some more thinking, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the organization. I really appreciate it. So I personally believe that knowledge is produced through confrontation of ideas. That's why I choose to be maybe slightly provocative by, choosing this topic of, I will be the advocate of a carbon tax, knowing quite well that Ian disagrees, actually. So I hope that that actually I choose to be the advocate of a carbon tax, knowing that you will disagree. So I hope that it will lead to fruitful discussion. So my take on it is that I personally believe that given the urgency of the climate problem, we have to act fast and we have to act hard. And I believe that taxation and carbon tax is a very good way to do that, because we know how to implement a tax, and we know how to use fiscal tools to address explicitly the kind of regressive aspect of a carbon tax. So I hope that at least we will agree to disagree. So as was mentioned before, the climate change issues is very urgent, and it raises, a lot of problems: biodiversity loss, ocean acidification. I personally work on the impact of climate change and conflict and migration, so I really feel that we have to do something, and something fast. Okay? But of course, this objective should not be achieved at the cost of high inequality or poverty. Okay, so we have to solve this tension. So can we reach the Paris objectives? This agreement to stabilize at 2 degrees. So here I will talk about stabilization at 2 degrees, not 1.5 degrees. So the numbers, on top of being provocative, is going to be slightly boring because I will use a lot of numbers. But in order to reach this 2 degrees objective, basically, of course we have to do massive investments in infrastructure. I totally agree with Jan on that. Okay, housing, transportation, energy, we have to do it. It's very consensual. We have to invest in green R&D. That is very consensual as well. And we have to switch from high to low carbon services and goods. So we have to switch, as David mentioned, from awareness to action. Okay, but it's a tool. Which tool do we use to, to change the system, to switch consumption, to switch the structure of consumption? I personally believe that carbon tax is a good way to do it. Okay, so a carbon tax aims at increasing the price of carbon-intensive goods and services. So the point is not to punish people who pollute. Okay, the point is to change behavior of people. So the idea is that if prices increase, then basically you change your, at least that's the idea, is you change your behavior. Okay? If the price of energy increase because it's carbon intensive, well, okay, I will change my habits, my behavior, and I'll switch my heating in my apartment from 22 degrees to 20 degrees. I'm talking about experiment here. Okay? I'll take more often public transportation because the price of gas is higher. We'll stop using coals to produce electricity because it becomes too expensive. So by changing prices, we change. The objective is to, it's to change behavior. Of course, we need deeper discussion on needs. I personally believe that the notion of needs is fundamental, especially in economics. But to accompany this move, we need to switch incentives of people. And usually tax is a good way to hit where it hurts, basically. The problem is that actually it hurts, so I'll talk about that in a minute. So what is the magnitude of the tax? I want to put some numbers because it's pretty abstract. What is a carbon tax? What is the number? How, it will change stuff, but how? Basically, at the moment, it is estimated that a tax of $50 to $100 per ton of carbon is needed to reach, to stabilize at 2 degrees. Okay, I personally believe that it's closer to $100, but by putting a tax of $100 per ton of carbon, and if everybody is paying the tax, that's a crucial aspect, okay? We're good at making assumptions in economics, so let's make this assumption. Everybody is paying the tax. Then basically, we stabilize at 2 degrees, okay? So that's coming, it's not me, it's Nick Stern and Stiglitz and other far smarter people than me who reach this number. So the idea is that basically, major tax on carbon will raise prices of all carbon-intensive goods and services, okay? So that's the point. So that, when you compare prices, okay, this is becoming far more expensive, so I should change my behavior, okay? Let's go to, it's a signal. I should use something more efficient, better for my own budget. But the problem is that, of course, it will raise prices, okay? So this is, sorry, the graph is horrible. The color is terrible. But basically here, on this axis, you have years, okay? And on the vertical axis, you have price, okay? It's just examples of some carbon tax that are implemented in practice. Here, you have the range of prices needed to reach the Paris Agreement. So if we want to stabilize at 2 degrees, we want to cut consumption, we need to reduce consumption, we need to reduce production, okay? And the way to do that is implement a tax so that people consume less and produce less, or produce or consume differently, okay? So this is the range we need. So below, you have this $4 or $5. It's basically the price of carbon on the joke market, the ECTS market, okay? It's not a very serious price, obviously, okay? But if we look at, for example, the CO2 tax in Switzerland, some of you will discover that we do have a CO2 tax in Switzerland, okay? It's 84 francs, actually. It's a pretty high tax. The thing is that it covers very few industrial emissions. Okay, actually it covers 80% of residential emissions, meaning that we do pay this tax on energy and most of our consumption. but it covers only 20% of industrial emissions. And it covers only 30% of electricity emissions, so generate electricity. So the coverage is a big issue here, okay? Is first the big issue. So if we were to implement this tax to all sectors of the economy, then basically Switzerland would, according to this model, would reach Paris Agreement, okay? Yes. So the thing that, of course, I have 2 minutes left, so I'm actually 2 slides, 3 slides. So basically, if we were to implement a high tax, so it will have distributional consequences. Okay, here I use empirical studies. In the US, last year, they did this study of what would be the impact of a tax, a carbon tax on prices, on income. I think it's very important information for us if we care about poverty and inequality. It happens that a high tax would rise, so $73 actually, would raise price of electricity by 20%, okay? Price of gas by almost 50%. Energy goods by 20%. Food prices will rise by 5% and water services by 5%, okay? It's the point. The point is to increase the price of goods which are carbon intensive so that people stop using them, okay? But it has a cost. It's highly regressive, exactly as Jan mentioned. Poorer households will have to support a higher burden than richer households, okay? Because maybe you can cut your 15 travels per year to 14 travels, airplane travels per year. It's very difficult to cut, your food consumption if you are already at the margin of your needs, actually, okay? So carbon tax is nice, but we need other fiscal tools with that to curb inequalities. So in practice, there is actually many experience, and I will conclude with that. Many experience of carbon tax in Canada, in the US, Sweden, in which when the carbon tax was introduced, people took the money from the carbon tax and basically find ways to redistribute the money to the people who needed it the most. So for example, in Canada, it was a green check. So basically, we take the money from the tax and we just redistribute it to all households, okay? The other thing that was implemented in British Columbia was to take the money of the tax and basically diminish tax income on the lower brackets. Okay, so the first bracket is 0%, and then you simply diminish all brackets. Okay, so you make it more progressive. If you like plutocracy, basically you can diminish, tax on capital income and stuff like that. Only if you like, this type of things. So, just as an illustration, here's on this graph, you have, poorer people on the left and richer top 1% on the right, Piketty people. And basically, we implement a very high tax on US people, and then we will redistribute money, okay? And basically, this bar will show you if their revenue their taxation, will increase or decrease. If you look at the yellow bar, we take the tax money and we redistribute the tax money evenly across people, which was done in Canada. You see that you decrease actually the taxation of poor people, so they get richer, and you increase the taxation of richer people, so they get poorer, relatively. So you decrease inequality, okay? So that's actually what would happen in the US in 2025 based on this scheme. And I finish with this slide. But that's what happened in British Columbia, okay? That's the median household in British Columbia, carbon tax of $30, curbing tremendously emissions. So that's the carbon cost, $125 for the median household. The rebate was 120 francs. You have direct transfer and cut in income tax. Basically, the average income was richer after the carbon tax and the tools than before. Okay, it was even more true for the poorer people. So it's these kind of things that I think will curb emissions quickly and can be implemented in a year. Okay, so that was my case for the carbon tax. Thank you.
Well, do I have to switch this on? Or am I? It's okay, I can start, can't I? Wait.
I'm sorry, I don't find the presentation of the panelist.
It doesn't matter. Anyway, Jérémy first. It's good to see the carbon tax idea being coming up again, because I thought most economists had tired of trying to argue it. I've been in so many discussions with economists. It's the insouciance of it all, I think. The insouciance that we can have a $100 tax on carbon across the world. You didn't bring in the global aspect at all. They normally argue for a global carbon tax, because otherwise countries which impose the tax would suffer competitive disadvantage from countries which didn't. And this notion that we can move to a $100 global tax, I just think is just pie in the sky, and it won't happen. And if it does happen, they won't do the redistribution which is necessary to deal with the effects. I mean, there are, of course, high carbon taxes. In Britain, we have a high tax on petrol. And you could say, well, that's a carbon tax. But as you say, it covers just one part. And in different countries, there are taxes which do that. But to extend to a total carbon tax, which would have to be global, because otherwise steel and cement and all sorts of industries would become uncompetitive. I just don't think will happen. And if it does, and then there's the distribution of the compensation argument. If you go for a means-tested compensation, then more and more people will be dragged into means testing, and they will have disincentive effects as a result of that. Also, it's very difficult to compensate particular households, because access to the gas network, or whether they're in a country area, need cars, all these things affect their carbon usage. So it's very difficult to compensate. And if you compensate by giving all citizens a basic payout, it's tiny, and it won't do the trick. So I think for all these reasons, I still don't think it's a goer. David, well, you put more eloquently, in a way, some of the things I was trying to say. We are talking about financialized inegalitarian capitalism as the dominant form, though it is worse in the United States still than in Europe, if you're looking at health. And it will require a massive shift, and you're right, Thunberg and the rebellion, Extinction Rebellion movements have been very important here. So, in a sense, the most radical push has come from the environmental side, not from the social side. But it needs to link up with the social side. Otherwise, you can imagine a scenario of environmental radicalism and social conservatism. So the two need to be brought together. But I have some good news. I mean, the Labour Party, I don't know whether they'll get power, have just come out with a programme for a very substantial Green New Deal. The advantage of that is that it goes to every constituency in the country, because everyone gets something, because you're retrofitting houses and so forth. They've also come out for universal basic services, free bus transport for all families under 30. And they've also come out to renationalise water, gas and electricity over time, but recognising that if you want to have a social, if you want a cohesive system change, you have to get rid of the privatisation and the fragmentation that was brought in by the Thatcher reforms. So there is reaction going on. A corporate capture is being challenged. And another example from Switzerland, I think there was a referendum recently on a desirable maximum and minimum range of income. I think it was 12 to 1, and it was lost, but it was lost 2/3 to 1/3. So 1/3 of Swiss citizens favoured a 12 to 1 range, which is phenomenally squeezed compared with a 200 to 1 or whatever you've got. So I thought that was also a straw in the wind. I think there is a reaction back, and I think the climate crisis is driving it. So, stop there.
I would invite all panelists to come back to sit to the table. I guess we need to put this on. Is it okay?
I want to start by saying thank you. Everyone gave very stimulating and interesting presentations, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit it to 2 that are hopefully of interest to other people here as well. First of all, on the idea of universal needs, obviously when it comes to kind of normative ideas like the idea that anything is universal, a lot of issues come up. For example, is meat a need? It's well known that animal agriculture is one of the biggest contributors. And so, you know, there are alternative protein sources. So, yeah, basically just a question about how you could envision, I guess, defining those universal needs. And then one question kind of, so we've heard the past 2 evenings about the struggles facing unions and the fact that they're kind of disappearing. But there's also obviously kind of a need to help workers transition from brown industries, etc., to more green jobs and skills. And so given the fact that in order to develop really effective and inclusive and positive policies for the communities affected, it's good to have their input on those policies. And given this kind of, I guess, loss of unions, what can you envision the role of, I guess, governments and employers being in this kind of dearth or absence of unions? Thanks.
Thank you. I think we will take 2 or 3 questions, and then we will give you the word.
Good evening, and thank you very much. In the Century Declaration of the ILO, one of the objectives is the sustainable growth. And after this evening, I'm asking myself if it is not more or less an oxymoron. Can we exchange about this? And another, it's not a question, in fact, is that I feel a little bit uncomfortable that when we are speaking about the future, the panelist is only male. Thank you.
Say that again, please. That last part.
Exactly what you said. This is an all-male panel, and we are very sorry for this. This was not the initial intention. It just turned out to be that way. Sorry for this.
You have another question? Hello. I just wanted to ask a question in regard to taxation when you're talking about this issue of tax. And I think when you talk about this, sometimes in some countries, even the country themselves, in terms of collecting tax, is still a problem. So there's a lot of informal sector, and is even a big problem for many countries to collect their own tax at the moment. But when you talk about trying to impose these taxes on addressing climate change, so I don't know how to address this further, because many countries in the global south specifically are still struggling with collecting taxes. And then secondly, in terms of political will also, because like when you talk about transportation, you talk about issues of oil and gas, the people who control such kind of economy, they're the same people in politics. So where do we draw the line? Because they're the same people who make these policies. So when you try to tax these and you try to control this, they're the same people, politicians, who control this type of economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe a last one. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Among the different externalities, actually the environment damage is one of the most complex, in the sense that the cost is intergenerational and interregional. So, the solution also needs to be, international, as you said. If there is a carbon tax in one part of the world, the other part of the world would benefit in trade or production otherwise. But how we can go over this divide of developing, or rich and poor countries? Because in all those solutions or discussions that we heard today, there is this burden of poverty and inequality, especially on the poorer countries and in the poorer regions. So that would make any solution impossible unless there is a model that covers the development issue and the poverty as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think now we have more than enough to give you back the floor. Who would like to begin? Jan?
Well, can I just deal with the needs for a start? I could go on for half an hour on this. Human needs are universal, we argue, and others do as well. Martha Nussbaum, for one, and some eudaimonic psychologists. Participation, health, and autonomy come up as the three basic themes. Now, those are very general terms. And from within that, you can then derive needs for nutritious food, shelter, and so forth, and good relationships. But I think the key thing is that needs are always distinguished from needs satisfiers, which are always, almost always, local and contextual. That's a fundamental distinction in the theory. And so, is meat a need? It's a need satisfier among many others, and different communities can make decisions about whether to encourage or discourage meat eating. So that's the broad answer to that. There was one other question. No, let me pass on from that.
Yes. Anyone? David, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. I think it's too early to say that the labor movement is dead. If you look at the statistics of labor movement, of trade union membership, you'll see that in the private sector, they've been going steadily down. So the private sector, through a range of tools, has figured out how to avoid paying decent wages and engaging the workers collectively. In public sector, it's remaining relatively stable. Privatization, it has not hit as deeply as one would think, even though where it has hit, it's ugly, and it's a big problem. So, what can the workers do? And this relates to the question on countries where there's a lot of informal work. First of all, the more, as Ian said, the more you grow your public services, the more important it is for those who have less capital to spend buying things. And so did you say it's at the poorest elements, the public services represent 75% of their income? Whatever it is, it's a big chunk. So having access to healthcare, to transportation, to schools that don't come out of your pocket. But let's remember, no public service is free. It has to be paid for one way or another. And hopefully the working conditions of the teachers and the nurses and the people maintaining your roads is decent. Again, in public services, it's the majority of our members are women. The only reason I'm up here is because I do climate. And I could have had another colleague up here, and I totally agree. 5 males on a panel in 2019, that's just not cool. And so it needs to be worked on. In terms of informal, look, whatever your country is, if you get the multinationals operating in your country to pay the taxes they owe in your country from the activities in your country, you're already doing a lot. If you get the multinationals and the super rich to pay, that's great. Then the second thing you've got to do is to make sure that the services that those taxes are used for are what the people need, and not taken into other purposes, which can be the case. Then, in terms of, look, for us, the tax rules have to be fixed globally. Because you will continue to, if you try to fix them in one place, they'll move their profits somewhere else, or they'll do internal transfers. So it really requires a global fix. How do we get a global fix amongst 190 plus members of the UN or the 208 countries on this planet? It's going to take work. And someone mentioned political will. That's what we've got to create. And that's what Greta is creating, that's what the Extinction Rebellion and various other movements are pushing for. And my challenge from representing the workers in your countries and your communities is to get them engaged and not to feel fear for loss of their jobs. Because that is one of the worst things you can do to a trade unionist, is present fear of loss of job, or to any worker. Once you lose the ability to feed your family, to provide health care and housing, then you get paralyzed and you get defensive. And so that's in part the reason that the just transition concept is so important, that when you have to shut a coal factory, was it you who mentioned stranded assets, is a way that the capitalist or the owner gets to write down through their taxes the money they lose from the steel and the concrete that is no longer producing. But the workers never get compensated. They just get left on the side, and that's where we fought for the just transition concept in terms of ensuring that the workers affected are somehow compensated. And we're not just talking money. I too could go on for longer and longer, but I'll leave other colleagues, please.
We may give the possibility to other panelists to react. Maybe Moustapha, you want to say, or Jean, you want to say something?
Well, maybe one word I want to say about the engagement of trade unions is that when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated in Paris, there were not less than 400 trade union members who were there involved in the negotiations. And I should say that if we have this reference of decent work and a just transition as important elements of the Paris Agreement, it is to a great extent due to that engagement of the union movement. So I think what we can perceive as a dynamic even within the ILO is that among our three constituencies, the ones that drive the sustainability agenda are more so trade unions than governments or business leaders. And I think that's because of the understanding that there won't be any jobs on a dead planet. I think the union members understand that very well, more than others. And I just wanted to end by saying that, Professor, in your last slide, you questioned global engagement and global social policy when it comes to environmental challenges. I think if you see what has happened this year at the UN Climate Action Summit that took place on 23rd of September, every year the UN Secretary General convenes this summit. But there was a very new and critical feature this year, which is that there was an action area called social and political drivers. And this discussion on social and political drivers was meant to reflect the fact that unless social dimensions of climate are addressed, we risk having very powerful forces of resistance, because people would say, we're going to lose jobs, we're going to lose economies. How do you turn that risk of obstacles into drivers of action? And if you see the result, we have counted 43 countries that made commitments that they will formulate just transition plans as they go next year to raise their ambition on climate change. And if those just transition plans are based on social dialogue, skills for transition in labor market, social protection, so all the social policies, and I think this is a very important development. So that will mean that going forward, we're not just talking of environmental policies, but environmental policies that go hand in hand with social policies.
Thank you.
I wanted to comment on the carbon tax. In that sense, there is another way where systematic finance is moving, is to try to stop new investment in oil, on fossil fuel. In that sense, you know that we already have too much, we have too strong part of them, but we still have every year more than 400 billion which are still invested by fossil fuel industry to dig for new source of energy, for new source of fossil fuel. And the most investment community is focusing now, biggest part is focusing with a large coalition, try to stop that. And the way used is that to ask what type of internal price do you have for the CO2 tax in the future. And just as an example, Total renounced to invest to coal because the tax they anticipate with discussion with investors was at 40 euros a ton at the horizon of 230. So the coal is no more competitive regarding to the gas, and just Total divest from coal to the use of this internal future price. And there is a huge coalition now to try to fix for every new investment in the fossil fuel, what is your expectation of carbon tax? And there is some agreement to say, okay, can we attack 40 euro at the horizon to the other 30 and perhaps 50 to 60 as the horizon later? And there is try to stop is the most dimension we have now in the conflict, is really to try to stop. It's not easy because the cultures they have, it's very too difficult. You cannot switch if you have a discussion with CEO of Total. He say, I understand what you say, but now I do with my capacities at Total, engineer, I am able to generate 13% of return for investors. If I switch my investment into renewable energy, as I am not that capacity, I only be able to generate 8% of return. And actually investors stop this move. They prohibit Total to do that because they want to continue to generate the 13. So you see the importance of what do we want from this, the market want for those companies. And actually, it's not possible for them to move, and the same with Shell, because the market will not let them do less return with another technology which is more clean. That's not easy.
Thank you. I think Jérémy wants to...
Just one quick word on this, on the two taxation questions. I totally agree with you. I mean, I can see a world in which we have a single carbon tax, so that's contrary to you. I have far more difficulty seeing a world in which we have, redistributive fiscal tools at the international level. So it's clearly a huge issue. I totally agree with you. But even internally, if we have a, but the thing is that it's true for the tax, but it's true for any other policy tool that you can think of. And it's the same for internal, for some countries. If a government has difficulties, low capacity to raise taxes, I believe that it will be difficult to implement other tools such as consumption corridors or quotas or whatever you think of. So, if there is a low capacity in raising taxes, I believe that state capacities, it's very difficult to implement other tools as well. So that's my own take on it.
Thank you. I think we have some time left for another round of questions. We have one question here. Wait, I will go. Here you are.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I have two quick questions, just about facts. One is about the carbon tax in Canada. Do you actually know other examples, except for the British Columbia example, where it was used in a redistributive way around the world? Maybe you can elaborate. And then I was curious if you look at the shareholder democracy argument. I was just interested at the moment, who makes the decisions for these shareholders? Is it the finance minister of the country, or who is that actually in reality? And then like a general question to you, Professor, about your argument on, in your book, you say, you talk about human needs, and you talk about degrowth, and we saw the problematic, how it's difficult to realize this in a capitalist system, but you must have thought about like a way forward on this. What are your thoughts on like the next step in this degrowth argument? Thank you very much.
Good luck with that. Any other? This is opening a very small question. I think that's a nice way to close the debate. No. Any other question or remark or comment? Please. Can you?
If I can just ask quickly, this is relatively quick.
Sorry.
So on the shift from a consumption-based to a production-based accounting of emissions, I'm actually from Australia, so there's been a lot of debate recently about how we are, accounted for the emissions that that are produced with the coal that we dig up. So if the consumption of that coal is attributed to us because it came from us, our emissions skyrocket. And so I was just wondering how you kind of brought the fossil fuels into that kind of consumption, production, emissions thing.
Okay, and then we just have another one from the plenary speaker of yesterday.
I just had one remark about what Mr. Laville said. You said that when an oil company undertook to invest in the markets punished it. The markets was a shareholders' meeting. Obviously, if they go from one investment that yields 30% to an investment that's at least 8%, the value of the stock is going to go down, and the owners of the stock are going to accept this going down. It's not the market, it's those people. That's all I wanted to say. It's identifiable people.
That's the problem.
And you're right, they are not going to accept this reduction in value.
Don't expect us to be renewable energy. They will never do.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so then before giving you the floor, I would just ask if you think that the notion of production corridors would make any sense? An easy question, too.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Production corridors.
Yes, the notion of a corridor was to fix a maximum. Okay, yes, if you're going to think of a maximum and minimum levels of consumption, that does imply some stage maximum and minimum levels of production. But because of the disjunction of the world economy, the outsourcing, the benefit of the consumption approach is it focuses attention on the rich, on us, and all the stuff we import, all this stuff that we import and consume. I think that is the way to do it, because the distribution of income in the world is so unequal that I think that's the way to do it. Yes, also on your question, I know I've been in talks with Australians. They say there's a third method of measuring carbon, and that is the amount of which you dig up and export of raw materials. I haven't got my head around that quite. That might be something which is specific to Australia with its huge coal and iron and so forth. But I think the fundamental difference is still the production and the consumption based. And I'd like to see this coming up the agenda much more, because all the figures you see that you'll read are always territorial production figures, and they show Britain and all Western countries merrily decreasing their consumption, whereas their emissions. Whereas if you look at all the stuff we consume, the carbon embodied in those, is going up. So it completely distorts the reality. And then the move to degrowth. Okay, I do have some ideas about this, although it is almost inconceivable. I mean, I've always been aware of this. The Marxist in me says there's this global system capitalism. It has its driving force, and it's not compatible with degrowth. But there is one transitional form which is important here, and that is to reduce hours of work. And that keeps coming and going as a theme and a slogan. There's books coming out of it on it next year. So you've got productivity increase. You can take this out either in wages or in hours of work or some combination of the two. And it's not unknown for trade unions collectively to bargain for some reduction in hours of work instead of going for the full whack of wage increases. So that's a collective way of moving in this direction. And then there's a more individual choice way, which is to give people choice, more choice over the hours of work that they do. So Robert Skidelsky said it's amazing that when you sign a contract, you don't normally have much control over the hours of work. So those are two ways. And Juliet Shaw shows that reducing hours of work is very important for emissions. 40 years ago, Germany and the US had roughly similar hours of work. I think 1,800 hours a year. In the last 40 years, Germany has reduced its hours by 20%, and American hours of work haven't changed. And so you can see that that's two paths of growth, and one is intrinsically less carbon intensive than the other.
Thank you.
So I've done something positive.
Anyone else that would like to add something? Yes, David.
Yeah, there was a question again about shareholders, pension funds, and who makes decisions. Who in the room has heard of BlackRock? This is an asset manager with $6.8 trillion under management. The next one is Vanguard with $5 trillion, Charles Schwab with 3.4, and then in fourth place is your own very beloved UBS with 3.1. These are the ones who move markets. Now, I mean, if I had some slides or whatever, I'd show you that after World War II, the growth of wages and the productivity went pretty much equally. And then after 1970, wages flatlined, and the money, the excess money of productivity went mainly to the financial firms. And now we're getting the UN SDGs, which are saying we have to move from billions to trillions. We don't have enough public money, so we've got to get these big funds into delivering public services. And I tell you, this is about the worst plan that we've ever heard. It's like, because the World Bank pushed privatization for so many years, and eventually it stepped back and said, oh, we were a little bit too euphoric about the hopes, and the UN system is now way too euphoric about the hopes for private capital to help deliver the SDGs. I need to recommend to everybody to look at UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report 2019. It came out 25 September, so what is that, 10 days ago? And it's all about the global Green New Deal. UNCTAD is known as sometimes taking more progressive line than other UN agencies. This is very, very worth reading. The question of the previous round of the man in the white shirt and tie about developing countries, rich and poor, one of the things that we're looking at with our tax issues is how much money is moved from poor countries into rich countries through manipulations, through globally accepted, to us unethical, but manipulations of different manipulations and illicit financial flows. You mentioned Paris. I was there. I was one of the 400 plus workers. At the same time that we were negotiating, or pressuring, because we weren't negotiating, pressuring in Paris for a better deal, here in Geneva at the Australian consulate, there was a meeting of the TISA negotiators, the Trade and Services Agreement, which, thank God, got trashed, I'm not going to say by who, where they were negotiating the energy chapter the same week. And we got a leak of that, and what they were negotiating would have prevented governments from engaging and implementing renewable energy. So it was, for us, it was just so anomalous that, here we are in Paris looking for the future. And the other thing is the planet won't be dead. Will be dead. The planet will be fine. It'll evolve in the way it's evolved for, however many, I'm not a geologist, but will be dead. And then final word I would say is look out at what's happening with local and regional governments, municipal governments. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the people go for help. And they are declaring, more and more cities are declaring climate emergencies and looking for tools to solve the problems that they have to deal with, whether it's influx of refugees, whether it's further demands from the people who live and work in their territories. Thanks.
Thank you. If I may ask the other panelists to be very short because we want to come to a close. Don't worry, don't worry. That's a job.
Yes, to come to your question, I will say we have now to align our different hats as individuals. We have to align our as a consumers. We have to align it as a way we vote, the way we invest, the way we work. And that we create this acceleration that we need. We have an exponential problems. We have to solve it with acceleration. And when we all be able to align what we vote, what we do, what we consume, and how we invest, we have a real opportunity to have a chance to get in.
I think this is a good word, good closing word, if you don't mind. And I guess the good point of any good debate is that it raises frustrations in the end, and so that you want to go on debating. And so we have a cocktail reception that is organized just outside the room, where you will be able to go on exchanging and debating, and maybe also with the keynote speaker and the panelists. Now, I would like, in the name of the University of Geneva, to thank you, and I pass the last word to Pierre Martineau-Lagarde, who is the special advisor for socio-religious affairs for the ILO General Director General, and who helped us to put up this series of conferences and roundtables.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. It's a pleasure being here and listening to all our panelists. What I would like to do is not an official thank you, but an informal thank you to all of you who have participated, to our panelists and keynote speakers. It was great to be there in the long series. To our other panelists also, you probably recognize that we built around the tripartite format of the ILO, having as much as possible social partners, but also civil society and academics in the panel, so as to enlarge the debate. So that was a preconception of that. So thank you for having played that game or that conversation. I would like, in addition, to thank Professor Bonvin personally for all his personal investment with his team. I'm looking for some of Aris is very visible. Emily also, who has supported us. Geraldine, who is not there now, but was there. So all your team, the team of the rectorate also who joined in supporting. On my side, for the ILO, I have a special thanks to the man who has been going around up and down. This is Adam Bauer from the communication department. Has been greatly supportive in all types of media communication, from the social media to the most traditional. Also to someone you don't see here, but she was there from the team of the Centenary, Antoinette Julie-Vermeer, who has been very helpful in helping us working together and be there tonight. Also a special thanks also to, where is Duncan? Channel. And the team of the interns at the ILO who join us in supporting also this event and communicating with their fellow interns in the ILO and the other UN organization about it. And then let me also add a special thanks on the team who you don't see much, but has been also very helpful in the design of the team. Professor Paul Dembinski from the University of Fribourg, and my colleague from the ACTRAV, which is a service to the workers, and ACTEMP, service to the employer department, as well as the research department. Now, Adam will kill me if I don't do the very last thing is to ask you, invite you, urge you to come up the hill on Tuesday, the 15th of October. We have our open day starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You are all welcome. I think you owe that to us because we've moved down. Now you can move up. And thank you also, just to you, the audience. We recognize each other. Maybe some of you are colleagues. Special thanks also to our former colleagues who have joined us and other colleagues who are here today. So to all of us, I think the idea was to have a conversation. That's why we have a cocktail to continue in that same spirit and enjoy the company, the discussion, the challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Allez, enfin.